Thank you. Thank you, President DeGioia. As you could tell from the things I've been fortunate to get here from Georgetown, it's good to be the friend of the president for 25 years, close to 30 actually. It's a remarkable privilege to be here with all of you today in this room, which did not look like this when I was an undergrad. And Jack was a resident assistant here, so he knows just how bad it was. And, you know, as Jack mentioned, one of the awards I was honored to get here was to speak at the medical school commencement, because that's one of the schools I went to here, but I have to say this means a lot more. As I think you all know, this is a Jesuit school, and Jack talked a little bit about the service that's imbued in this institution. And for those of you in the Christian tradition, you'll know that we're in the third week of the Easter season. That's a very important season in the Christian tradition because it is a season of hope and it's a season of renewal. And there's pieces of that are pretty applicable today as for a graduation ceremony at a Jesuit school. And a few weeks ago, there was a reading which I think has great meaning for this event and for your lives. It's a story that occurred after Jesus was put to death and was raised, according to the Christian tradition. And his disciples, Peter and John, were going to the temple not long after that happened. And they came across someone, a handicapped individual who was handicapped at birth, who'd been begging in front of the temple since basically he was able to crawl to the temple. And he'd been there every day for many years, probably decades. And there's people like that, who many of you have seen, who everyone just walks by on their way into the temple. But Peter and John stopped, and they healed him. And that was known as a great miracle. But there was a part of the miracle that the stories emphasized that led to the miracle. In some ways, they were the first steps of the miracle, and in many ways, they were a miracle themselves. The first thing they did, and the scripture is very clear on this, is they stopped and they looked. They looked at a person no one else would look at, a person that everyone just walked by. So they looked at him first, they acknowledged him, they accepted him as someone worthy. They accepted him as someone worthy of being seen, worthy of being healed, really worthy of being loved. Someone who no one else had regarded. And then from that, they acted and they healed. And those steps, looking, seeing, counting someone worthy, loving, acting, are the basis of social justice. And in this one story is the basis of social justice that has built the foundation of the best parts of the Christian tradition. Pretty fitting for this event, I think. When I was at GU, things were a little bit different. And Jack knows when I speak, I almost never speak about myself. In fact, I never speak about myself. But this is a fairly different event for me anyway. So I was here in the 80s first. Actually, I was here basically from 1981 to 1992. The experience then was a little bit different. Not only was this room different, but you never would have had this many people for anything resembling a Lavender graduation. But it wasn't unique to this institution. It wasn't unique to Georgetown. It was the reality of the early 80s. But I can tell you that back then I certainly wasn't out, wasn't for many years. I wouldn't even see myself. I wouldn't even acknowledge myself as being worthy, let alone someone else. How can someone else do it if you don't do it yourself? There was one gay person I knew, who came out in his senior year. He was ostracized. He was kicked out of his apartment by his friends, so-called friends, and actually had a really, really miserable life. He's now really involved in your work, actually, at this university. In medical school, where I went not long after that, there was no one, no conversation, no discussion, pretty much just ridicule. Sadly, I'm not sure it's much better at the medical center. I understand there's only one graduate here, but I know Dean Mitchell cares a lot about it, and his presence here speaks volumes about that. In between those two experiences, I worked for Father Tim Healy as his assistant, which is how I met Jack, because he was the assistant several assistants before me. So it was quite a while ago. I happened to be assistant, which is functionally chief of staff, in 1977, 1988, when the so-called gay case moved forward. So it was the case, for those of you who don't know, where Georgetown had refused to fund a gay group, a group on the campus for religious rights, religious freedom, and was sued. The case had been in the courts for a long time, and I happened to be the assistant when the decision came down. I remember distinctly when the decision came down. So our board had to decide, would they appeal the circuit court decision that required Georgetown to fund the group or not? It was a very different time. So the board had to consider what to do. Would they appeal to the Supreme Court or not? It was a pretty extraordinary conversation, most of which I can never talk about because it's in the confines of a boardroom. But I will say it was extraordinary and eye-opening. Members of that board, self-defined conservative Catholics, stood up and said, my sons and daughters have friends who are gay. Am I to tell them that they don't have meaning? Am I to tell them at a Jesuit university dedicated to service they are not relevant and don't deserve to have funding for an organization for them? The decision of the board was not to appeal that case, to actually begin the process that led to the center actually existing. So I think it's pretty appropriate that we're here with Mrs. Tagliabue, chair of the board, building on that tradition of the board, funding an organization or providing support to this center, to this organization, and how that grew and was made possible by that first decision. It's a fulfillment, really, of what started then. Now, Jack was dean of students at the time, so he went through all of this. He actually saw those board members stand up and see their sons and daughters' friends, to see them, to acknowledge them, to understand that they were as worthy of care and compassion and love and healing as their own children. And I have to say, this university has been extraordinarily lucky to have someone like Jack in this position. I remember when he was elected, some of you may not know, he was the first, and I think only, lay person to be elected president of a Jesuit university. It's always been a Jesuit. My Jesuit friend said, that's not a problem because Jack's more of a Jesuit than most Jesuits, with the exception of having children. And Jack really is the person who's led this change, led the ability for this to be held, as you just said. And I have to say, the Jesuits are very lucky. The Jesuits, the Catholic Church, Christianity, the Christian people, and all of us are extraordinarily lucky to have Jack where he is, because I don't think any of this would be happening without him. So, and she was great too. So from those beginnings in 1980, here we are. I mean, as Bob said, look around this room. There wouldn't have been one person to show up for a Lavender graduation when I was here, I have to tell you. Now look at this. You have your own center. You have your own chocolate. Who has their own chocolate? And I'm lucky enough to be here at this graduation with my husband of 16 years. That doesn't happen that much. Who's also a Georgetown grad, actually, business school. So that change, that evolution from very difficult times to where we are today, still with a lot to do, it was really a microcosm of what was happening in the broader world. None of this was unique to Georgetown. What was happening in this country, what was happening around the world in other countries, and in the city, and the evolution is still occurring. The evolution is still occurring. As Jack mentioned, I was privileged to be in the State Department at a very exciting time for those of us who work in development. That required Senate confirmation. It required a security clearance for an openly gay man. It required all of that to happen in what was perceived as an incredibly conservative administration. And it was a pretty remarkable time. Condi Rice actually referred to Jason, my husband, not at the time my husband because it wasn't legal, as my mother-in-law. That caused some stir, actually. And it actually got to the point of being brought up in the White House briefing by the Director of Communication. And they were asked, how can you do this? Did the Secretary make a mistake? And the gentleman responded the way Condi and President Bush told him to respond. He said, she said what she said, she meant what she said, and she said that out of respect for the people involved and for everyone else who's in the same situation. Imagine that 25 years ago. Imagine that in the 1980s. I think I'm the only openly gay head of an international organization ever. I'm certainly the only current one. I suspect there have been some in the past, but not openly so. And that's an extraordinary thing, that in an international organization with an election, including many African governments who are perfectly aware of where we are and who I am, that you can be elected to a position like that today. That was not possible. It was not conceivable in 1981. I have the great privilege to travel around the world. In the past month, sadly, I've been in Zambia, Swaziland, Honduras, Haiti, Papua New Guinea. I don't know how many of you know things about these countries. Pretty difficult environments. I have the great privilege to meet with groups from the LGBTI community. Now, when I started this work, 25 years ago, if you tried to have such a meeting, it would have looked like Lavender Graduation in 1981. There wouldn't have been anyone in the room. Now they're crowded rooms with people who are active in their communities, publicly talking about their sexuality, publicly meeting with the governments. These are countries in which it's illegal to be gay still. Yet they're out in force with the governments at the table. It's extraordinary. It is extraordinary what is happening out there. That was inconceivable 5 years ago. Inconceivable 5 years ago to be in a room of 25, 30, 35, 40 people in these countries talking about rights for LGBTI. We hear about the problems in the countries, and they are real. They're where we were in the 60s, 70s, 80s. They are real. They are real and difficult. And many of you might know, and you've seen the laws that people are passing, our countries are passing. I don't know how many of you know who Justice Edwin Cameron is. He's an extraordinary man in South Africa. He's openly gay, he's openly HIV positive, and he's a member of their Supreme Court, their highest court, the Constitutional Court. He's an extraordinary man. And we were talking about what's happening in the countries, the way these laws are being put forward, what's happening in those places. And we both agree that it's the natural course. Sadly, it's the natural course. Because 10 years ago, 7 years ago, in most of the countries that have passed these laws recently, if you asked, what are you doing about your LGBTI community? The answer would have been, we don't have to do anything. We don't have any. They're not here. That's you. We don't have such people. People are seeing. They're looking and seeing. They're seeing what's there. And this is unfortunately a reflection and a reaction to what is happening and what is inevitable in those countries. And what's really exciting is what's happening on the positive side, which you probably don't see much about. So in Uganda, the High Court struck down the law, said it was unconstitutional. Now, it was technical grounds, but that was engineered in all likelihood. Struck down in Uganda. In Kenya, when a similar law came to the floor of the parliament, the Cabinet Secretary for Health went and spoke on the floor. This is a minister, a member of parliament, a minister, and said, you cannot pass this law. It'll be the worst thing possible for HIV. You're going to drive people underground. You can't do it. They actually didn't. Now, later they did, and the courts just struck it down as unconstitutional and against the rights of their people. In Rwanda, the president vetoed a similar piece of legislation that was never passed. In Zambia, the First Lady talks openly about how we need to get over, former First Lady, how we need to come over homophobia. She's not a former First Lady because she said that, actually. She ran for president. She's former First Lady because her husband died. But to have a First Lady talking about the need to come over homophobia in Zambia, inconceivable, not long ago. The party secretary, the head of the ruling party in Namibia, has publicly said it's time for us to get over homophobia. This is bad for us, it's bad for our people, we can't do it anymore. And former President Moai of Botswana is now aggressively publicly speaking about the need to change the culture and is bringing together a group of former presidents, because they have a little more flexibility, to push this issue. Inconceivable 5 years ago. Inconceivable 5 years ago. Now, not to say that things are great. They're not great here. They're not great here. And they're not great anyway. And we have a long, long way to go. I think you know in many countries in Europe, surrogacy is illegal, gay adoption is illegal. Our so-called liberal friends in Europe, where these acts are still illegal. We have friends who cannot adopt children that they had together because of the laws. So we have a long, long way to go. But sometime when you're looking forward, it's good to look back. And what exists today, here at Georgetown, in this country, in the world, in countries that we are all privileged to be part of in development, in Africa, Latin America, the East, it was inconceivable 5 years ago, and not less than inconceivable a decade ago. It's reality today. Sometimes we push and we push and we push. We are frustrated. We feel like we're going to get nowhere, and then all of a sudden everything changes. We don't know why. It just does. It changes. And then when you look back, you say, well, of course that changed. But when you're pushing and pushing and pushing, and you feel like you're failing, you're actually not. You're changing everything. And this is why Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice. And we are bent towards justice today, and your lives will improve, but many others won't. So I have a question for each of us, including me. Who do we walk by? Who do we not look at? Who do we not see? Is it people who inject drugs? Is it homeless people? Is it people in prison? Are they people who have different political views than us? Who do we walk by? Who do we disregard? Who do we not reach out to heal? Who do we not welcome into the human family? Every change, every miracle begins with looking and seeing each other as worthy of being healed, as worthy of being loved. We can only heal and love after we look, after we see. And I can tell you that as we look and see and work to heal others, and I'm sure many of you know this, we actually heal ourselves. When we heal others, we heal ourselves. And we love ourselves just a little bit more. So let's all go forward, look, see, act, heal, and love. And if we do that, there'll be many more of you sitting here and many more graduations to come. Thanks very much.